Hi, so I'm going to tell you about something that happened to me a while ago. I had a sudden, intense, temporary psychosis following the birth of my daughter. This was definitely not postpartum depression. This was so strange and so out there that I still sometimes have a hard time believing that it happened to me. At the time, I was married to a wonderful man, and still am. I was an attorney with my own professional mediation practice, which I loved, and we decided it was time to have a baby. Our future looked bright. We had no idea how wrong things were about to go. When I was in law school, I learned that some women can harm or even kill their children due to an imbalance of mind following pregnancy. But I thought that meant those other women, those women who already had major problems, not normal women, and certainly not successful, professional, educated women like myself. And so I was completely unprepared when it happened to me. I'm going to give you just a small glimpse of the worst part of my experience. So, I was on my bed, and my daughter was lying next to me, and that's her, cutie patootie. And I saw myself take a scissors and plunge it into her and cut her open from here to here. And there's blood everywhere. I turned away. I said, this has just got to be a bad thought, a bad thought. And I started gathering up every sharp item I could find in the room, purposefully not looking at her, terrified of what I would see if I did. So I took all those items that I gathered up, and I went to another room, and I put them in the back of a deep closet, thinking that if I was ever inclined to harm her, I would have to go there and get something out of the closet, and that would give me time to come back to myself, which, by the way, I now know, of course, doesn't make sense, but it made sense to me at the time. I went back to my room, and as I crossed the threshold, I saw her there on the bed, cut open, with blood everywhere. And I thought that I had killed her. I don't know how long I stood there. I was home alone and psychotic. But eventually, I realized that she was just laying there on the bed, peacefully sleeping. It had just been a hallucination. And still, it was the worst thing that I ever experienced. Fortunately, I recovered from the psychotic symptoms shortly after that. And I decided nobody was ever going to know what I had been through, because there's too much stigma, and I had too much to lose. But I wondered why I didn't know. I tend to be very informed and educated about things. I had gone to the classes, I read the books. How could I have not known about something like this? When I began researching it, a medical text that I found said that it would be obvious to anyone around the woman that she had psychosis. Well, obviously not, because my family and all of my medical providers missed it. The books that I found that did mention postpartum psychosis basically said simply that it was rare, or some went so far to say rare and a medical emergency. So imagine my surprise when I learned this is as common as Down syndrome. so it's not that rare. It's just less visible. We don't see the 90+% of women who have this and who don't harm anybody and simply get well again. We don't see many of the suicides that result from this illness, or even many of the times when women harm their children but don't kill them. In fact, only a few of the infanticides make national news. Probably the most famous one of these was Andrea Yates, the Texas mother who killed her 5 children in 2001. When that happened, I thought, this has got to stop. These tragedies could have and should have been prevented. All of these women sought help. There is much more that we could do. We could assess to see if women are at increased risk. For those at high risk, we could make sure they have plans to prevent the illness from occurring. We could make sure there's broad education so any woman who experiences this herself or her family would know enough to intervene quickly and seek help. But we also need education and training for medical professionals and crisis workers and for police officers and others so that when women do seek help, that help that they get is adequate so that this doesn't happen. These women are not evil. They are like you and I, just a lot less lucky. They didn't want this, nobody. It's not showing up on the bottom, but nobody would want this, right? Nobody would ask for this to happen to themselves. So after the Andrea Yates tragedy, I decided I needed to speak up. I now know a lot of women who've had this. My network of survivors, the number one thing they want you to know is this can happen to anyone. So after Andrea Yates, I started speaking up. I never wanted to be the poster child for this or any other mental illness. This was not on my bucket list. It was hard going public. I feared the stigma and what it would do to myself, my family, and my career. I still get the I don't wannas before every talk, really bad before this one. And the hardest thing I ever did was to put my story in my book. Since then, I've talked to many families, and I've heard over and over, why didn't we know? Why didn't anyone tell us? And I've heard, but she was the nicest woman. She was a good mother. She never would have harmed her children. But they didn't know, they weren't prepared, they didn't think it could happen to them. And now, a good mother and a loved child are both dead. Because this illness, it doesn't care how good or how nice you are. Its cruel delusions can cause a mother to kill her child out of love. And when a tragedy happens, we tend to blame the woman, say that she's evil. It's easier than thinking that something like this could happen to us. But that isn't going to lead to prevention. If we want to prevent this, we need to treat it as a public health issue, not an individual problem. Now, I know that this talk isn't going to change things overnight. I know that more mothers, sisters, daughters, wives, granddaughters, cousins, and babies will die, and more women with a temporary illness will go to prison. And for each of those, many more will suffer in silence. And tragedy or not, chances are they will be stunned that this could happen to them. And so, in spite of those I don't wannas, I speak out And before every talk, I tell myself, if this helps one family, if this saves one life, it is worth it. So I thank you for giving me that opportunity.